Computer. Hi, welcome everybody. I'm Barry Kostrinsky. This is Artist Talk on Art, the ATOA. The ATOA is a 501c3. We've been around since 1975, usually the Lower West Side of New York City at various locations. Presently, we're on hold given COVID, and these talks, these regular Monday night talks, has been our response. When things are better, and we know they were getting better, and there's a little bit of a blip, we'll know for sure when we can go back to in-person programming, and we'll let you know. For now, we're virtual, we're on Zoom. There are benefits. We have Francisco at midnight coming in from Spain, certainly advantages. I do want to say what we have coming tonight, we have Raegan Truax speaking on performance. Part of our Performance Mondays, our first of the month Performance Monday program. This is a program that Verónica Peña has sort of run with, programmed everything, organized, and also moderated along with me and done a great job. It's a program I think we started February, and this is probably our sixth talk. It's been a great series, but it's a series we're going to end with this talk, given that we're probably going to eventually be going live first Mondays, and the next first Monday is a holiday, and we will be showing performance when performance is presented as a panel. But for now, we're going to move away from our monthly performance. But before we do, I want to thank Verónica. As we were talking about before, you had Yali Ramagaza present. She was in Hyperallergic 2 months after she presented, talking about disproportionate placement of women in museum shows, and specifically Latinx museums, Latinx women. Their museums have been addressing the theme of Black people not getting shown, of it certainly being a white history to Western art that's been presented. And there have been many changes made, but it hasn't addressed that much the contemporary Latinx community and a little bit the Latinx culture in the last 100 years. So congratulations, Verónica, for bringing her here, and to her for getting her word out, and that's a lot of what we do and what art is about here. I want to hand it over to Verónica to introduce Raegen, but I do want to say we're a 501c3. All of our talks are free. If you'd like to contribute, you can find information on our website. And I do want to thank all the contributors who do send checks in or call up and use credit card. We appreciate it, and it certainly helps our budget. Shout out to Fran Beeler, one of the board members of the ATOA that is here now and present. And I'd like to thank all the board members for all that they do. Verónica, thank you so much. Let's not consider this an end, but the start of something new. And I'm sure we will put together something interesting. This has been great. Welcome. Tell us a little bit about Raegen.
Yeah. Thank you, Barry, and thank you to the board and to the entire ATOA for letting me host performance art here. So without more waiting, I'm going to introduce Raegan Truax. Let me read a little bit of her bio. Raegan is a durational performance artist and choreographer who creates visceral environments and takes breath, sweat, skin, and time as her primary materials. She most often performs in long consecutive durations without taking breaks, fasting, in silence, and without a timepiece. And just a little bit of something very notorious on her bio. Traux' work has been included within the Marina Abramovic Institute's Immaterial Archive. And I'm going to let Raegan to start. Thank you one more time for being here.
Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Verónica, for the invitation, and Barry for inviting me to be part of this platform, and even for the last performance talk. I was actually thinking a lot about this question of, how do we as performers let people into our practice? Specifically, this is always a question for performers because we're working with the live body. But in my particular practice where I'm working in such long durations, 37 hours, 8 days, 3 months. The documentation aspect of it is both unruly, sometimes intentionally so. The medium of duration probably inherently resists a bit of legibility, which makes it always interesting to be invited for an artist talk, because I always kind of go, what do I say? And I should note that for the last 20 years of my performance practice, I have performed in silence at every performance. So really the artist talk is kind of the moment where I open my mouth, I guess, in a quite literal way. So after hearing what you guys were talking about, I actually want to skip around my way in today. And I'm tempted to start by sharing a piece from 2017 called Citation, because it is a performance piece that specifically deals with the idea of what is cited, referenced, made legible, known about in the art world and the performance art world. So it's both a question and a problem for these large institutions like MoMA and PS MoMA, but also in the story of performance art, there's a really white Western male dominated arc of that story. And for my lineage of performance, I'm sort of trained by myself, but with the knowledge of women from all over the globe who work with time in ways that I find really compelling. And these were queer women who were just running into the streets to perform, and often not from a Western context. So that's sort of my lineage of performance that I decided to think about, how would I conjure that up in a live moment in a way that wouldn't be re-performing someone else's work, but would be something that I called with this work Citation, a live act of remembering. So I think I'll just share my screen, and if you'll bear with me to jump to that slide, we'll actually engage that piece first. And maybe I'll do the thing that scares me the most, just to get it off of the off of the table. And I'll start by showing a video, which is daunting because the work is 37 hours long. So there's literally an hour where nothing might transpire, So I'm going to show a 7-minute video, which is a big risk for an online platform, but it does have some narration through it. And I think it gives a sense of the tempo of the work, maybe before. Let's look at a couple of images first, and then we'll look at the tempo of it. So.
Sounds good. Reagan, let me ask, where are you coming in from?
So right now I'm in residence at Haverford College. I have one more year on a fellowship here in the Hereford Center for Arts and Humanities. So that's where I'm physically located, just in Philadelphia right now.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll just give you sort of some of the images first. And it's important to note that these images aren't necessarily blurry. There's really very little light in this space. So in 2017, this was made for a queer performance art space in San Francisco called Counterpulse. And it's a relatively small space. You're seeing most of the stage here. All of the seating was blocked off. So as an audience member, you walked onto the stage in order to witness the piece. And the stage is littered with rocking chairs, as well as these kind of still chairs, which most people would sit in. People also sat on the floor. I'm primarily working with the rocking chairs, and then also these frames that are hanging in the air. So the piece consists of sort of conjuring up past works by artists that I consider to be part of my bodily lineage of performance by performing these, I don't know if we want to call them ghosty, I don't know if we want to call them dancey, but these duets with the rocking chairs. So the rocking chairs somehow become bodies throughout the piece, and then other times they're really chairs because they fall and they break and they run into me and they rock sort of on their own. By the time we get to hour 30, it feels like they're moving themselves sometimes. So there's 4 parts to this movement piece, and the 4 parts repeat for 37 consecutive hours. And during that time, I don't leave this space that you're seeing on the stage. And the door is open to the performance space for anyone from the public to come and enter the piece at any time. So this is sort of a later moment in the piece where the chairs are piled on top of me. And the next kind of part that happens in the performance after some sort of dance with a chair that I often find kind of enters me into a memory of a work by a different artist, is that I then I have, you can see sort of these bundles. I have these bundles and they have a permanent marker in them, a small piece of sandpaper, and then this gauze that you see wrapped around them. And once that duet with the chair has created or manifested something that for me feels like an authentic memory. And truthfully, when you're performing for this long, it doesn't take that long to kind of create that portal to a really different time space. Then I try and capture it by writing it down, which would be sort of the more scholarly, more traditional thing that we're used to seeing in how we record a performance or something that we witnessed. So I use the permanent marker to write it on my skin, and you can sort of see that on my chest here, that I've written something down. And then you can see this audience member has, taken the opportunity to come somewhat close and try and engage with that part of the process. So from there, I think I'm just going to show you the video and it will sort of explain what happens after that.
When you arrive as an audience member to Citation, the house of the theater has been closed. So you have to walk onto a dark stage in order to begin witnessing the performance. The chairs littering the stage will remind people familiar with Pina Bausch's Café Mueller of that ghostly work. And indeed, Citation is bringing the body into a kind of conjuring. The piece can be excruciatingly slow. And often when I show parts of the video documentation, I can see people who didn't see the live performance, watching the screen and looking to see if something is stalled or stopped on the playback. In fact, it's just the very pace of the performance itself that produces this stutter and this hesitation and this sense of being stalled or suspended.
Reagan is their man.
James Loreno Grady's 1983 Harlem performance Art Is, where O'Grady was challenging and confronting not only exactly what art is, but what work the frame can do to make bodies visible.
Reagan, is there meant to be sound with this?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay.
There is sound. Are you guys not getting the sound?
We were in the beginning and then it stopped. You want to try the little sound button?
Did you just get a little sound blip?
I think that's all I got is a little blip.
Oh, no. So then that was really difficult 3 minutes because it is actually narrated to explain.
No, but we were listening to the narration, Reagan.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry.
The narration is the sound, isn't it? I'm getting sound.
Yeah, the narration.
I'm getting it.
Oh, my mistake. My mistake. Yep.
So yeah, so it's really slow, and that's sort of that's why it's always a bit risky to show a video of a durational work, because it's very I don't know if heavy is the right word. I mean, you guys can give me some words of your experience, but I think it will pick up, and if I can cut it short too if it seems a bit too late.
There are times when there's a fierce rage and a different tempo to the piece. One of the moments that I remember from the recent performance at Counterpulse in San Francisco, I became possessed to keep as many of the chairs rocking as possible, which meant running really quickly around the stage. I was running and the chairs would topple over. The sounds were quite strong against the relatively silent soundscape of the performance. As it happens in this piece, I don't know in advance what my live commitment to remembering will manifest, so I just kept running, banging into chairs until I suddenly felt this need to cradle one chair and melt to the ground beneath it, almost like a burial, like a moment of reprieve after so much anger. And as I felt the weight of the wood pressing down on my solar plexus, suddenly I knew I was in mourning and rage, which is a protest performance Susan Lacey and Leslie Labowitz made in 1977. The performance transitions from the movement sequences to moments where I try to record what's happening by writing on my skin.
So that material is sandpaper. It's hard to maybe tell from the video.
Ray, what are you erasing? Is that a memory or
Yeah, so it's sort of like it's the thing that came up, and then I write it down in the live moment. And then to play with this problem of legibility, like you were talking about with the artist you mentioned in the beginning, I begin to sand it off my skin. And so throughout the performance, I'm constantly, sanding different parts of the skin.
Do you write down after some of the things that
There's
you
labor,
erase?
pain, and blood and erasure in the story I'm telling. And the sandpaper prints created out of skin, sweat, and ink become the record of each citation that happens during the performance. Once hung from the suspended frames, everything begins again.
So Veronica, you were asking, do I write down?
Like, do you ever write down the things that you remember that you wrote so you don't forget them, or you don't?
So what's written on the skin in the live moment is for that moment only. The only thing that gets written down, if I go back to this, I think I have an image, is the actual citation. So this sort of becomes this is like the ink in the skin and the blood and the sweat that's sanded off. And that's really, for me, the capture, like what you're talking about, the capture of the thing. And then I do my best to record the artist. So this Rebecca Belmore is an Indigenous durational artist who's been working out of Canada since the late 70s, mid 80s. And so, and then I try and title the piece Creation or Death. Maybe I remember the year. This one I did pretty good. I remembered it was performed in 1991 at the Havana Biennial. But in the video, you guys are seeing relatively early video footage, primarily because the piece gets pretty bloody. Not like super bloody. I mean, it's a gentle action, but you're re-sanding different parts of the skin that have already been sanded because this is a 37-hour piece that doesn't stop. So what starts to be recorded even on the back of the sandpaper gets a little diluted, though for the most part, everything is relatively accurate. There are times when I might write down two artists because I'm trying to think of like, where am I in time and space? But I think that kind of, for some reason, that process for me, when the body performs in duration, you start to see the physical toll. If you're there in person, you can see the physical toll quite soon, I think. But the mental exhaustion is really hard to convey to an audience. And so somehow this process of really trying to remember and completely falling apart in that attempt multiple times, somehow for me made that kind of mental labor, or that labor of like remembering that we all experience with memories, come into like a tangible form.
Reagan, I did want to say, I once read a book that said, 3 ways to attain enlightenment. There were 2 paths. The third path is the one I want to mention to you, is the one of where shaman or individuals put them through extreme pain, extreme sensations that are very hard to endure. But the idea is they then open up to something more. Through, obviously, you're sanding your skin off to the point where you're bleeding, you're going with no breaks, you're pushing your body and your mind, and you're also making yourself act in the moment constantly. I sense you have a sketch plan, but then it happens. It sort of evolves in real time. What has been your takeaway from all this? What do you feel you've heightened your sense of reality? Do you feel you've become more present, more human? And what do you hope the viewer takes away?
Those are great questions. And I mean, we might even revisit them in different ways with different pieces that we look at, because it's always a different takeaway. I think that's what keeps me making the work, that I haven't arrived to some place yet in making durational performances. I'm still exploring new things. But what I would say is, as far as this, what changes or what transforms, one thing that opens up for me is that I don't have a better way to explain this than having a sense of always already being somewhat untimely is the word that I use. Veronica knows this word because she participated in the forum. So always already being out of sync with the standard ways in which bodies and people move in space and time. And so often durational performance for me is a way to start in my untimely body and then explore my art form from there. So, it's the takeaway is that time is a material. If viewers, when people come up, like one of the things that came back from Citation a lot, because it's such a different way to use a theater space, even just the fact that you can wander in off the street at 4 a.m. You can be anyone. And and you can come sit in that space with me and be in that space with me. And that's also something I constantly have to be present for, right? Is everyone who walks in the door. People often say, it's just like a completely different time. People often say, I only had 30 minutes. I knew my schedule. I only had 30 minutes. And I was there for 3 hours. Like I constantly see that written in the comment book. So I think to play with time and space in a way that is generative, but also not without the knowledge of how difficult that is. And so that's why like the pain in this performance is not, extreme in a way, like this performance burns. Like that's what this performance does. It really burns. But I never catch on fire, and it's sort of that mode of working that I think is honest. Because if it was easy, it wouldn't need to take 37 hours.
I'm just wondering, do you have physical scars on your skin from sanding?
I carry a lot in my body from a lot of the different works. And it's funny because I was sort of going to start the talk by going back to one of my first performances, only because in putting together some slides from the performance I'm going to show you next, which you can't see online because I haven't made any of it available yet. It reminded me that in the very first performance I did, like I literally carried that performance in every single step because I broke a bone in my foot. And so there's no performance I do after, particularly because I'm always I'm often standing for very long durations, where that performance isn't always already inside of it. And so the sanding, those wounds heal, particularly like as I got older and I know how to take care. I mean, that's part of this lineage of performance artists too, is like teaching each other how to take care of your body. But there are moments where it's not necessarily that the scar is visible, but I have the memory.
Right, your body carries from each performance to the next. Scars, maybe not the right word, but an impression on your physical self.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. And there are pieces where I do have the physical scar, but it's, I think what's compelling is these things surface in durational performance because the container is there to make them visible, but all bodies are carrying a lot, and that's where the connection is, that is, as Barry said, I think something about like human or intimate, that it's this sort of willingness to work with these things that are so quotidian in some ways. You know, I'm not necessarily moving like a dancer in this piece. And yet I can also balance, you know, like slanted like this for an hour now because of the piece. But that, you know, that sort of rock with the rocking chair wasn't anything out of the ordinary until I added the material of time and slowed everything down. And then it becomes, you know, a kind of different portal.
I do want to ask a couple of questions from the chat. First, Francisco Parra, he'll have a question in a sec, but he said he likes in the way that the frames are very special, he says, the fact that you're using them to expose the erasure of the memory, not the memory, which is nice. They have a parallel. Wendy List responds earlier when you asked, you know, you're using the word heavy to describe your performance. And I would say molasses is sort of like the heaviness. I'll throw that in a good way, though. Wendy says 2 words that come to mind are intimate and intense. I did recently hear something about a study about time and how everybody says, oh, it feels fast or it feels slow. The key thing to that feeling is the amount of presence and how you break it up in a small way. So if you're doing something every 4 seconds, time will go very slow. You're focusing on your breathing and motion and everything. If on the other hand, you're not present, you're not thinking, and you're sort of not engaged, then the time may be fleeting in a way. And yet after you do your performances for such a long time, I'm sure at the end, time has almost disappeared. And it's not a question of long or short, but like rubber that you've been, or bubble gum that you've been stretching and playing with. And I will say it's a common theme we hear and a really important one, because time itself, as water is one of the most important themes in all art, no matter what material you're working in. And for performance artists, they often do sort of time distillations. I'm not surprised someone said they came in for 30 minutes and they stayed for 3 hours. That's, you're working with that, and you sort of do it by slowing it down, by being conscious with every movement. Not easy to do. I did want to say, Francisco Parra, go ahead. You wanted to ask a question? I'll ask you to unmute. And let's see if Francisco
can you hear me now? Can I see? Yes. Okay, wait, thank you. Just, well, I talked about the frames. I just saw the part where you tie them up in a, tied your, my words in English, that you tie your bands and the frames. And also, I was thinking, of course, the relationship with the time is very interesting because there is no a narration, right? There is no, probably, I mean, perhaps could be, but there is a poetry of, there is more like a unknown ritual, I will say that. I don't know, I'm just trying to figure out, because in that sense, no one will expect a story, but an experience. So it changed totally the idea of being a simple spectator. In that sense, it's very interesting, the relationship or the interaction with the public, with the people. There was that person who sat and interact with you, and that's, I think that the presence of another one, of another face in the middle of that situation takes you to another level. How can you engage that person, because he's another, or she's another person, but also where is he getting in, like in your house, in your experience. So that's a really interesting experience for me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for all of those thoughts, and the phrase around the frame, you know, capturing, it was quite poetic actually. So I really appreciate it.
I have I have a thought which might not be, I don't know if it's tied into exactly where you're coming from, but I think of performance art as another method of an athleticism and a, you know, honing the body to do certain things. And there are training things where in people who are athletic, they talk, there's these ideas about how you slow down time, and being able to slow down time allows you this different kind of focus. And I was just wondering if any of that, do you think of any of those things? Does that come to mind with this idea of slowing down time? Because you're literally physically slowing down time in your movements, but you're also slowing down time mentally. And what I'm not saying this in a very articulate way, except that it feels like there's some tie to when you practice slowing down time. And I'll give a weird example. Like I used to play a lot of tennis, and that idea of the ball coming at you and figuring out how to slow it down. So because it's speeding at you, and that focus on it turns it into this, for lack of a better word, a meatball. It turns it into this easy thing to see. So you have now taken all of your focus on that one object, and literally you're doing this in your performance. I know I'm making these like strange ties, but it feels a lot like an athlete as well, honing your ability to do these things for whatever that's worth.
No, I think it's, I mean, I think we should look at some more work, because I think some of these questions around time and relationship to the public and slow time versus fast time, and how you begin to work with these things as an artist, right? Because that is sort of the challenge, is it's not just that you immediately know how to slow things down. And truth be told, Veronica could speak to this too. The more you actually as an artist try to slow things down, like many things in life, the more resistance you get. So, I mean, it's like I started with like the one theater in the world that let me keep the doors open for 37 hours. But for that one curator or person who takes that risk, you know, there's a lot of resistance, even in a moment when performance, you know, performance goes in and out of being sexy or unsexy, hip or not hip, everywhere and nowhere. So even in those moments when there's even like momentum around slowing down or being still, that's actually when I find the people who are most trained to do something like be still become the most invisible. Right, because imagine if we all, you know, had really stopped when the pandemic came, or, you know, I mean, that's really a heavy thing to think about, because we need you know, different people need many different things. But what does it really mean to stop the chaos of daily life? You know, and our inability to do that, I think, has never been proven more than it has in the last 2 years. Because what is the motivate, you know, like, what is your body in time for? And what is your body producing for? Those, I think, are questions where I found like my practice really rubbing into daily life more in the last 2 years, because suddenly everyone had to endure and be sort of durational in their own habitus. And what do you inhabit in that moment? And how quickly do you want to get back on someone's clock? You know, whose clock is that? Was it the clock for your body? Was it the clock for your livelihood and sustenance? You know, these are sort of interesting questions that I think the practice is always asking, but that I've had to ask of myself even more deeply in the last couple of years. So let me maybe just show another work. And it's not a new work, it's from 2019, but it's taken me about that long to get a lot of the documentation together in a way where I feel that I can share it. And And this piece will have a really different, it's still a slow piece, but it moved locations. So, and then I can also show like a fast piece that goes on for a really long time. So we can think about like different paces in durational performance. Let me just find the slide I want to go to. Okay. So this is a performance from 2019 called Slack. And I've done several performances where I don't work with any materials, but more often if I'm working with materials, I work with 1 to 2. So in Citation, it was really the chairs and the sandpaper. This is a piece where I decided to work with these 3 marine ropes, which are, ropes that are used to anchor boats. These are each 100 feet long, and they each weigh between 22 and 28 pounds. So what I decided to do for Slack, the piece took place over 3 months, and this woman, whose name is Alexis Roberts-Kiner, who's a visual artist from Southern California, but who also is a hairdresser by day. So you get the perfect combination of someone who knows how to work with materials and someone who knows how to work with hair, which is what I needed for Slack, because I wanted to have these 3 ropes embedded into my hair for the 3 months. So Slack was performed once every 10 days for 3 months. So this is a different way that I work with time and duration. It's not a, one-shot consecutive 37 hours, but sort of 10 parts that unfold slowly over a course of time. So each individual performance lasted between 2 and 6 hours, and that mostly had to do with whatever space I was in. The piece happened almost 100% in public space. The first performance was a piece that was commissioned and curated for the Mojave Sound Art Festival in just outside of Joshua Tree, in the desert, basically in California. And this was a piece that was like in my brain for a long time. And that invitation sort of allowed me to start the piece, or gave me that push of like, you have a performance and it's going to happen on this day. So the first piece, which is what you're seeing now, happened in the desert. And it, for each piece, these ropes were sewn into my hair. And the challenge was really just to move with the material in the environment that I was in for the public that was there, for, as long as the body could basically carry this slack. So these are the parts. This is all you can see on the website, is an image of the ropes in each of the 10 spaces that they traveled to, attached to my body. And I'm going to show you some of the images of the different performances. So other than that first performance, this was never sanctioned. It always happened in public space. And I made the choice to not have a photographer for the piece. So all of the images are candids that were taken by Alexis, who would come to do my hair, or, friends like Lexi, who's here today, was in the area and saw a couple of these different parts. So the thing I kind of love about this, when we start to see the documentation, is you will see how many people actually take pictures of me. And I'm always so curious where all of these pictures of me with this rope hair ended up, because people took thousands of pictures, and I have no idea where any of them live. So the piece this is it starting in Joshua Tree. This piece was 6 hours. It was 112 degrees that day. I'm barefoot and silent. And you can see that I've come out of the piece. This is probably, 3.5 hours in. And this is kind of going back towards the end of the piece. So I'm just going to cycle through some different images just to give you a sense of the different spaces this piece took place in. And then I'll show a 20-second video at the end. So as I said, the ropes, they vary between 20 and 24 pounds, 25 pounds. So by the time that they're pretty extended, they can, hold my own weight, and it's increasingly more difficult to move them. we went to Lake Merced, which is, it's usually a pretty popular like jogging spot in San Francisco. It's not necessarily a public park. It's not the most pristine public park. But there's this passage of a bridge that's about 100 feet. So my challenge was just to kind of walk across, you know, in one direction. Then I went to Yerba Buena, their garden. And this was, the first two were sort of similar as far as the score, you know, walk in one direction, walk back. This walk in one direction. This, you can see that I actually started the piece with one of the ropes on one side of the garden and the other two ropes on the other side of the garden with the intention to sort of go pick up a rope and come back. And the great thing about performing in public space is the sprinklers will suddenly come on and you know, you don't know that you're standing right next to all of them. So you can see that the ropes are spread across the park, and this created quite the scene at Yerba Buena of much policing and much silent murmuring as I was performing about, you know, how long I may or may not be able to be there, if the ropes were a tripping hazard. All of these conversations sort of happening around me, and more sort of authoritative bodies swarming in on me. At which point I decided, even though in the performance, the intent was only to move the ropes without like pulling them with my hands. So I probably should have said that earlier. Like the score is to carry the rope as if it were attached to my body, not as if I'm just carrying it with me. So after about 4 hours of different large authoritative men hovering around me, I just, there was a artist who I collaborate with who was really pleading the case of that I should be able to stay, who happened to arrive sort of at the tail end of this. And he's seen a lot of my performances in public space and pretty much came over and said, you know, you have to leave or you're going to you're going to get arrested and etc. At which point I didn't relent at that moment, but I sort of listened to the next step. And then I just slowly bent down and, you know, kept my eye on the head of this space and just pulled the ropes toward me, because the issue was that they were spread across the lawn, right? The issue was not that the performance was harming anyone. And that goes back to what Barry was saying of, you know, and also what Francisco was saying of how other bodies start to come in and create the piece with and for you. Because it was so interesting that the conversation from the beginning was, she has to leave, right? And that's part of the training of working in duration and working in public is there's 1,000 other options that might be available to the body. If you sort of if you like pause and think about the situation and can mediate it in a certain way. So the Yerba Buena performance was quite interesting. Then we went into the ocean. Yeah. Veronica?
How, oh, my connection is slow. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, okay. You know, like how limited we are by society. You know, like like you say, she needs to leave, right? They could have also said she needs to get things together, or she can do this or can do that, but it's like we are, you know, it's so I see a lot of value when you decide to put these ropes on your hair and do that action, like spend your time doing this and emphasizing it emphasized for me the control that the world around has on us, and how difficult it is to escape those barriers, or how performance art kind of set light on what prevents our bodies from doing something different, right? Like we are not used to something different, so sometimes people cannot understand the different. It doesn't make sense for people. So I don't know. I am very. I saw your work before, but now I am reading it very differently. Yeah, it was just a comment.
No, I think no. Thank you so much. And of course, there's the counter to that too, right? Is that there is this authoritative body and this policing body, but so much of the public body was, ranged from like kind of the immediate, and this is also why I love working with duration in public space, because you can get this immediate like, oh, what's that? That's weird, right? But more often than not, when you have that presence and you do slow down, and when you can catch someone, you also have to catch them in that moment where they kind of want to turn away and keep going and just not pay attention to you. But when you can catch them, then there's this other thing that happens. And then, all around me, also in these performances, people are telling stories of everything that they've been carrying. This piece is 2019, so we're a couple years into a presidency that's really difficult. The US, there's just so many things going on, right? So that's the other ripple that starts to happen, is people start to relate to the visibility of struggle. And then that, I think, is also interesting when we think about what kinds of bodies are able to show struggle, who has to, sort of pretend everything is okay or not okay. And of course, when I do these conversations or these performances in public space, I am very aware of my body that's read as very female, but also read as white, and so I do know that I get away with things, though that also takes a sort of calmness and a certain thing to be willing to resist for your art, right? Because I wasn't going to leave Yerba Buena, even if they came and put handcuffs on me. Like, I wasn't going to leave. So that's also like, you have to be willing to walk into that if you're going to do it. And
Raegan, you and Veronica answered Ilsa's question. She asked, can you please explain again what your point or message of this work is? And I think you've said you want to show people there's a different time, there's a different motion, there's a different way to think. I think as much as you're doing something different, you want to point out to other people the sort of norm that they do is not normal. As well, Francisco Paris says, I totally agree. The barrier of communication and the fact that the art is developing outside, the calling finds you by surprise. And as Paul Celan said, it's like a poem, a message to unscript. And again, Francisco apologizes for his English, but Francisco, what I always say is less words is better. The thoughts come out, and certainly, you're expressing yourself very nicely. If you would if you would like to add, or Raegan, if you would like to respond, or of course Veronica, and of course feel free to go forward. Yes, Francisco.
Very quickly, just to I think along with what you were saying, the fact that you are taking the art is not a picture, it's not a music, it's a person, it's a performance, and you're taking it to in the outside where normal things happen. It's like confronting something different in normal people's lives. So that's I think that's great. I think that's great, and that's difficult, and it's exactly including all the prejudice I don't know how to say prejudice that we normally have regarding bodies, regarding gender, regarding many things. Yes.
Yeah, it's a little over. I mean, I haven't really talked about this work actually, so it's really, I like sincerely appreciate hearing people respond to it.
Reagan, I had I read this book, actually very weird, but I thought of it when I saw your work. It's this guy whose name is the Mighty Adam. I don't know if you ever heard about it. He pulled a bus on his hair through everywhere. And I was thinking of you and I thought, oh my God, this is not a bus, but it must be very heavy to pull, because on this picture, the robes look so heavy because of the scent and everything. Is it heavy or just does it look heavy?
It's really heavy.
It's heavy, right?
Yeah.
But he had a different idea. He wanted to show his strength. It was like a strength thing. It was not it was totally different. But I thought of this weight pulling, you know. So it looks quite beautiful. So
yeah, I love that distinction. I actually think it's really important because there can be, I mean, there are people who do these endurance kinds of works to sort of prove their strength, like for this reason of like showing strength. And in this piece, of course, you're strong to kind of do it. I think the strength is in like standing in public and just doing it, but it's showing actually all the failures. Like I fall all the time. It's like it's meant to be, you know, exactly as you said, something other than.
Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, definitely. It's also the material and everything. It has such a different meaning. I'm aware of that now. Also, you guys explained that. But and I thought of the weight. I mean, amazing.
Well, and that's why it's interesting for me. This piece, I think, would have not registered in the same way if I only did it once in one space, even for a long amount of time. Because as you also pointed out, in this particular performance, which was the fourth performance, all of the rope became one. It was the first time that it came together and became one. And then it just became this like mud shovel. And then I had to deal with that for the remaining 6 pieces. So as far as, and I also think that heaviness was something I was constantly confused as to how can it be visible? And and I'm interested in feedback on this. I'll show kind of 2 videos.
Can I interject for a second before you go to the next thing? Other factor that you're adding in there, 110 degrees on sand, so your feet are on fire. You talk about being barefoot, so you have now yet another layer that you've added, not only the weight, but you've got this layer of your, I mean, I can't even imagine what that's like on your feet. Can you, I mean, it must have been horrible just to be standing on that sand, and there you are doing that. Of course, once you are standing in a spot, the sand, eventually the pain subsides a bit because your own skin has already absorbed the heat, but it is, it looks unbearable to me. Can you mention if that's the case? I mean, that's like another factor.
I feel everything. So that's, I mean, it would be dishonest for me to say that I have some kind of buffer. And I have a daily practice where I prepare for these kinds of things. I'm looking at Veronica because of course I think of her and her water tank floating and how you're preparing the body for the performance, but in the performance, you can only be as prepared as when you like take that moment. So, I mean, I've never stood in 110 degree weather in the desert with like snakes and things on the ground for 6 hours. So I would say that I have trained myself to sustain varying extremities of cold and hot and heat in different times. But that was, again, a challenge of this performance, because across the 10 different locations, the weather and situations were radically different. So it's not the same thing as just doing the one performance where you know you're going to be in the desert and you know you're going to be in the warm, hot sand, and you sort of figure that out. It's actually 10 pieces where in each one, the weather is quite different. And I'll give you a sense of that, I think, with two different videos. So this is the ocean. And this day was 40 degrees outside. And it's windy and cold. So I wanted to show just a minute of that, because in these public space performances and in this idea of what translates, I do think that proximity to the body is important. So this is sort of an angle that you would see if you were standing at the end of the rope, which is, you know, about 100 feet away from me. If you get close to the body, you're going to witness this almost same moment in a really different way. And then I'll just sort of show, this was the 10th performance. And when you were asking about my feet, even when I talk about this performance, where I actually feel it is, of course, in my neck, I mean, it really took a toll on my upper body, but particularly my neck muscles. And so this was at Alta Plaza Park, which I decided, you know, I had been playing with these sort of single lines. When I went into the ocean, it was more of a descent into the water. And so I ended the performance by climbing stairs at this, you know, sort of beautiful staircase that's in the heart of San Francisco. There's a lot of public there at this time of day. And again, I was never using my hands, but by this performance 10, I could barely move the rope unless I gave myself some sort of like support behind my neck. And here you can again see that this rope isn't tied to anything. It eventually is going to go up all of the stairs, but it can hold my entire body weight if I lean forward. So it's really, really difficult to move. It takes the whole body. And while these performances look like the pictures can be a little pristine, you can see the city behind, the actual environment is like this.
You know, Ray, for a second my head went to this tale where, you know, there is the princess in the tower, and she has to let her hair go so the the prince can go up and rescue her?
Yeah, this, I had completely forgotten about this. It's this until when I started performing in public, some people would walk by and they would yell Rapunzel, right? Because that's this character who is in the tower. And initially I sort of thought, I don't know, it rubbed me the wrong way until I remembered what that tale is actually about. And it's something where I've been like trying to get different versions of it. That's actually a story that's told in many different cultures, right? All around the world. So this idea of this woman who's trapped in this castle is maybe a happy accident of something that people read onto the work, and that I just actually need to do more research around to get sort of the better literature for this story that's told, across the globe.
I'd have to share, I definitely thought of that when I saw you standing by the open window in the desert there earlier. Also, when you showed the first picture of you going up the steps and you had the ropes as if they were a train for a wedding, but of course it wasn't a white, light, long, flowing train. It was more like a weight, and it seemed to parallel a statement about almost wedding as ownership or a burden or weight to carry. I will say there was a question by Wendy, who took the photographs? They're beautiful images. I think you mentioned your friend who is here, Lexi Johnson, did that. Am I correct?
I think that in this image here, that this is Lexi, but I'm pretty sure that is Lexi. And she is maybe listening in while also working. So I don't know, Lexi, if you want to say anything. I'm sure if she gets a moment to chat with us, that she will.
Okay, she's welcome. Regina Gradis also says, in life, there are so many things that can hold us back. Your art symbolizes that to me. And Francisco Parra asks, can you repeat what you said about the perspective of the photos in this performance? There is no perspective like a theater, and that's a question.
So in this photo, this piece looks really still, I think, and often because a lot of my work is still, one could see this performance and think, Raegan's just hovering there for a really long amount of time if you only see the photo, which is why I am just sort of jumping into sharing video for the first time, because when we get to this video, you actually see that all of this day was really, really, there's nothing still. The ropes are blowing in the wind for the entirety of the performance. And there's just like, I'm getting wind whipped for the whole day. And this is also what I was saying, as far as going back into my own archive, is I definitely didn't forget this sensation, but you can sometimes look at the photograph of the performance and it can relay a story that is, I love these images. And I think that they do convey the weight, some of the movement that's happening, but they're really, really different than the performance itself. I think that's the leap I was trying to make, is that the photos really capture one thing and they lose a lot of something else, if that makes sense.
Totally does.
And the theater, I have to look at the comment to respond to theater. Was there something about theater that someone wanted me to respond to? Like in a theater, okay, what you said about the perspective.
Yes, it's
yeah.
Yes, no, you just said it is.
Right, so the photos frame the work in a certain way. And in the performance, of course, you don't. Like in this kind of performance, it's interesting, and it's why I sometimes use the language of choreography, or where my choreographic experience comes into play, because of course I'm choreographing for a certain public. I mean, and I spend a lot of time in the spaces before I choose them. So there were a lot of spaces I went to that I thought might be maybe better for the piece, but when I spent time in those spaces, the way that people move in them didn't actually speak to the work, if that makes sense. And that's maybe where I think this idea of perspective is also interesting. Is, you know, I'm definitely choosing places where I think there will be a real friction with how people use the space. This is a space where people will just jog up and down these stairs as like their daily exercise. And so it creates a really almost immediate tension between this idea that we were talking about from the beginning, you know, speed and slowness. There's struggle going on in both choreographies. Running up and down these stairs for 20 minutes is really difficult. So it's not to say that one is, you know, it's not to put any hierarchical value on either. It's just to show two different labors and two different ways of spending time, maybe.
It is an interesting
sort of, that's
point.
just like a memory that's coming up for me as one of the reasons why this space was like an interesting space to intervene in.
You do make an interesting point, Reagan.
I'm not sure what time it is, just because I have my share screen on. I could show
You have 10 more minutes.
other
10
work,
more
or
minutes.
I could talk about work I made during
Okay.
this last year, or we could just have some more questions.
I do want to say,
I could
Reagan, you
show
make
a
an interesting
fast
point.
piece that gets really slow because it falls apart. I don't know what is the, I of course have 50 pieces still queued up to show, but.
Well, you make an interesting point. Very hard to capture performance. Yours is an experiential art, let alone you go to a still photo that makes it look.
For some reason, I can't hear you, Barry.
Oh, can everybody else hear me or no?
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, maybe your volume, Reagan. Not sure.
I still can't hear you.
Okay, I'll let you talk. You go ahead, Reagan. Show us some more. We have about 10 more minutes. 10 minutes. I'll use the chat. Veronica, maybe you try. Maybe she can hear you.
Can you hear me, Reagan?
Oh, let's see.
Maybe not.
Maybe not. There.
I don't have any sound, so for some reason I'm not hearing. I'm trying to like make sure that I have all my videos and things closed in case that's the issue.
We can hear you.
Okay, I just had to pause the video. Okay, now I can hear.
All right. I do want to throw a real outside recommendation, because you did say you like to sort of engage people in spaces in different ways. And, you know, right away when you're talking about slow movement, I start to think fast food. And I can imagine you, Reagan, and you, Veronica, and another performance artist going into McDonald's to order and doing a performance where you take your elements and you do a slow order. And of course, the people will go nuts. It will cause a riot at the McDonald's. You're not allowed to take more than 23 seconds. But I think you'd get some press and find some interesting responses. Just an outside thought. Reagan, we do have 10 more minutes. Go ahead. Feel free to share some more images as you like. And Francisco, I love it. He likes the idea, but you should go as a McDonald's worker. Definitely.
With the goal of taking only one order in the day.
It's not about the fast food. It's about your slow order. You're distilling. And I will say, I think the heart of what you're doing is surrealism. You're making people look at something that may be common, even if you walk up steps, but you're pulling hair. You're putting a different, you're changing something and you're making the normal look abnormal and making us question. I think that's the heart of surrealism, and you do that in your work, as you do, Veronica. But there is something very strong, emotional. I like to ask this question. It may be tough, Reagan, but why are you doing this work? What in your past, what in your personality and your experiences, or maybe what you did when you were 4, how you play acted, what brought you to this point? Because you're not painting flowers. You know, Andy Warhol got to some pretty happy flowers. you've gotten someplace very deep. What brought you here?
That's a good question. I probably haven't, I think if I figured it out, I maybe wouldn't do it anymore. Which is like the artist, you know, our way of getting out of a difficult question. I can't say that it's one thing, you know. I can say that that lineage of women that I cite in Citation, I can say that, like many of them, I turned to performance because I didn't, you know, you don't need more materials than the body and space and time. And so if you have a background where materials, you know, I wasn't going to art class, no one was paying for me to go to dance class, but I was a very creative child, and learned that time is a pretty precious material somewhere along the way, and started to really think about politically. I mean, I haven't presented some of my most political works, but I would say that for me, this work is very political. To manipulate time and take time for the body and hold space and time for any body is really, really political labor. I truly believe that. So I could end on probably my most, I'll say my most overtly political work. Like, I don't think you could look at this work and not get it. There's many pieces that I think are more internally political. But this is a piece called Sloughing, and it was performed right after the presidential election as part of a collective of 100 artists in San Francisco who committed to making 100 performances in 100 days. 100 days of art, actually. So that collective was called 100 Days Action, and it was led up by a friend of mine and colleague whose name is Jeremiah Barber, who's a sculptor out of the Bay Area. Primarily a sculptor. He also does a lot of performance and has actually an amazing body of work. So when Jeremiah decided, okay, for the first 100 days that Trump is in office, we want to mount this 100-day long counter narrative to his action plan for that day, of course he called his good friend the durational performer and said, doesn't that sound like a durational performance? And my two reactions were, are you prepared to sustain that truly? Because, you know, it's one thing to have years to plan to do a performance that's going to last a certain amount of time. It's another thing to say, you know, someone got elected, the 100 days is going to happen. Can you sustain that? So I started to talk to him more about, maybe I won't perform and I'll strategize with you, because you're going to need a lot of support if you're going to support 100 people to do something over 100 days. That was one conversation. The second conversation was, you know, I'll do something, but I'm not going to do something for 100 days unless it makes sense. And as all of the different performances started to unfold, there were, you know, the map for everyone's work was created around Trump's 100-day action plan. So on that action plan, you have build a wall. So there were works that were mounted to have a counter narrative around immigration policies. On that action plan, there was, you know, kill everything in the climate because climate change doesn't exist. You know, so there were art projects that were built around energy and the environment. And when all of the pieces started to come in, the one thing that I thought, well, here's where I can contribute, was a more feminist stance against some of the kind of vile, not only language of the administration, but the direct attack on the Supreme Court to sort of overturn women's rights. So that was a hole that emerged within sort of the artistic works that were coming together, and one that I thought, okay, I'll make a piece and it will be a menstruation piece and it will last for 28 days because that's sort of the average cycle of menstruation. And I always think these things are interesting too when we talk about time, like whose average is that 28 days, but it was a number that worked for me. So I started this performance called Sloughing. I said it would be 28 days. It would take It ended up being in 19 locations because we were the only project of the 100-day collection that was not allowed to use any of the gallery spaces that other projects were able to go into, because we were dealing with blood. It consisted of 35 performers. It was really important to me in a moment of heightened political activity to do something that my body alone could not sustain, and to do something that was built around a sustained action, something that people would need to show up for beyond something like the Women's March, which of course these things are also incredibly important. So again, it's not to set up a binary or a value system, but just to say, what does it mean to sustain an act of resistance over a significant amount of time? And the piece was called Sloughing because that's the medical term for when your uterus sheds its lining. So the materials for the piece were these plywood boards. Any body that menstruated, some of those bodies don't identify as female. We had trans performers, queer performers. Menstruating gentlemen is the term that we became most fond of, genderqueer performers. So it was built for anybody that, you know, bleeds and was willing to bleed on these boards. So I'll show a couple of the performers. I started the performance, and it was the first time that I've ever created a durational score that I also stepped out of, where I had to trust someone other than my own body, my own training, my own work to carry the thing out. So here we're at a small woman-run gallery called the Royal Nonsuch Gallery in Oakland. They were the first gallery that said yes to us, after many places had said no to us, and them saying yes. Some of those places that had said no in the beginning, by the time we got to day 26, were on board with the piece once it gained more momentum. So this top picture is also in the Royal Nonsuch Gallery, but standing in the vitrine window that faces the public street in Oakland. This is the last night of the performance, which was at Counterpulse, where I then made Citation after sort of this initial encounter. Most of the performances, however, were again in public space, unsanctioned, us taking our plywood boards and our blue collar shirts and going out into public for up to 3 hours at a time every day for 28 days, and then, you know, bleeding onto the board. So this is around Lake Merritt in Oakland. And this performer, it was really cold, which is why she has gloves on, why they have gloves on, and they're performing on just a public house on a deck. So we also ended up doing these performances in people's living rooms, sort of a la Holly Hughes, who used to do the lesbian show in living rooms across New York City, really with a long history of women artists who perform, you know, the Women's House in San Francisco, a long history of people who created spaces in their homes, in public, in order to be able to do the thing they wanted to do, which is perform. So there's a video, this piece is part of there's a project called the Her Story Collective that did several interviews about this piece, and it was incredibly challenging. There's a lot of funny stories actually that go along with this piece. It is the piece that will be, by the end of next year, probably most written about in different scholarly books and articles. There's already been a couple chapters about menstruation art as a genre of art, and most of these chapters sort of start with artists like Carrie Schneemann and end with Sloughing. So I'm very, very proud of this work actually, and it's one where, you know, these bloody boards that I have and have kept over time, it's one that I would really love to see these boards on display, you know, somewhere, even as time itself has made them fade and change in the way that kind of blood does. And I think that's really fascinating actually, is that maybe by the time a gallery wants to display these boards, there won't be any visible blood on them, and that will be fantastic.
Well, Reagan, that was nice of you to end us on a light note.
Sorry. Yeah.
No, that was great. I think, thank you, Reagan.
Yeah, thank you, Reagan.
Thank you all for being here and for your comments and your question and your feedback. I really appreciate all of your thoughts and responses to the work. And I'll be able to have this transcript, right, Barry, because I couldn't read and talk at the same time. So
Yes, this will go up on our YouTube in a few days. It'll go on the YouTube. You'll be able to see it, and you'll see all. If you like, you can see other past talks for the ATOA. Future talks are listed on our website as well. If anybody would like to be a part of a talk or anything, just reach out. Again, we're Artists Talk on Art. We're a 501c3. I want a special thanks, of course, to Reagan for putting this together and, you know, for us to be exposed. This is art on a wide scale. Doesn't seem like this is for painters, but this will feed painters. This will feed people who sketch. You know, arts are all connected. So when we hear from a performance artist, they are an artist. So it's all the same issues. But we get to see how they handle things. Of course, your ropes or line, and artists work with that. So there's very tight overlays. I do want to give a special thanks to Verónica Peña. This has been the 6th talk, and she's done a great job. I think just like Yali is getting the word out by going and performing at PS1. Veronica, you've done something for ATOA. You've brought in a whole group of performance artists, a whole group of Latinx women who are underrepresented, and you made the ATOA do the best thing it could do, which is we gave a voice, we've captured a voice, it is recorded. Our archives do go to the Smithsonian, the American Archives of Art. So we're all sort of doing our job here. But Veronica, you put together so many interesting artists. You exposed us all. Thank you, Veronica. This has been a great run.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you to everyone. I know it's not easy to swallow sometimes, but you were fantastic and very supportive. Thank you, thank you.
You know, then again, art by Edward Munch is not easy to swallow. Van Gogh is not easy to swallow. Sometimes it's the really hard things, and you artists are addressing them. You almost, performance artists seem to throw themselves into the existential existence, sort of void of anything. Like you said, Reagan, no materials, just you and your body, maybe a rope, maybe some notes, mostly your memory and the art history that you feel has impacted you and brought you to this point. But then you really are you're diving off the high board, so to speak, into what you're doing. And I think, you know, I get a sense of relief. I don't have to do it. I can watch you and I can learn a lot and I can share the experience. And so I thank you for that. And I thank all of you for coming. Artists Talk on Art will be here every Monday. I appreciate seeing so many familiar faces and some new ones. And again, Reagan, thank you. That was very interesting. And Veronica, thank you as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
And I put in my email is on my website. So if anyone has questions about, I did drop in that last performance without much conversation around it. So please feel free to contact me there.
And I'll put that information in the YouTube where I do a little description as well, so people can have access to it. And also on our website where we show past talks, so if people would like to see.